Everyone talks, 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 but what is said lacks the minimum of clarity without which talking becomes a hazardous operation. That quote is by Jose Ortega y Gasset, and I believe it comes from Man and People. It might be The Revolt of the Masses, but I'm pretty confident it's Man and People. And it was actually the inspiration for this channel. I heard a lot of people talking, and I realized that not only were they not saying anything, but the things that they were saying lacked the minimum of clarity without which their talking was doing more harm than good. So what's wrong with the way that people talk about 1984? Well, what's wrong with the way that people talk about 1984 is that they talk about 1984 as if it was fiction. For example, there's a meme, it goes something along the lines of, "Make Orwell fiction again." But the truth is that what Orwell was writing about in 1984 was not necessarily fiction. The governments of 1984, the governments of the three superstates, Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia, were based off of governments that existed during George Orwell's lifetime. In fact, every single thing presented in 1984, I will go so far as to say every single thing, except for maybe one or two things, I guess not every single thing, is based off of things that happened in George Orwell's lifetime or things that happened just before his lifetime. One example of this, of course, would be that in 1984, the three superstates are constantly at war with each other and their alliances are constantly changing. Well, this also happened right around the time that Orwell finished the novel or would have started writing the novel with the end of World War II, with Russia and the West. Of course, Russia and the West were both fighting Germany. I'll bet Russia was kind of dragged into it. If Germany had never attacked Russia, Russia would have never gone into the war. However, there's a whole conspiracy there that's really directed at, they were actually all trying to kill as many people as possible, that it was all orchestrated. But I digress, that's not important. Maybe that'll be a topic for another video. Another thing that happened in 1984 that Orwell would have most definitely have been aware of was not only were these states constantly at war with each other, but in 1984, Winston comments he doesn't know if these countries are attacking themselves and then kind of blaming it on another country. He doesn't know if these are false flags. I guess during Orwell's time, the term false flag did not exist. However, they did happen. What Orwell was commenting on there did happen in his lifetime, not only in Nazi Germany with the burning of the Reichstag, but also in the United States. In the United States, you had several of these false flags occur in George Orwell's lifetime and just before George Orwell's lifetime. And I'm sure Orwell would have read some information. I'm sure that there was some literature, some writing on these false flags. I'm sure not everyone just listened and believed. So the first example of this would be something that helped us get into the Spanish-American War with the USS Maine. If you don't know about the USS Maine, I have talked about it in other videos. I'll just give you guys a quick rundown. So the USS Maine, they blamed its sinking on the Spanish. They said the Maine sank because of a Spanish ocean mine or something like that. But people had called this narrative into question. Engineers who knew a lot about the type of boat or the type of ship that the Maine was, and they knew that this ship was prone to internal explosions under the right conditions. So they wanted to investigate this. You had several people who wanted to do a forensic analysis on the ship to determine whether or not the explosion that sank the Maine was an internal explosion or an external explosion. So check this out. Not only did that forensic analysis never occur, but then what they did was, I forget what year they did it in, but to prevent scuba divers from coming across the wreck and discovering that, hey, guess what? It was an internal explosion. What they did was they brought the Maine back up to the surface. They dragged it out into the ocean somewhere, I think, and then sank it. So it's like 9,000 feet down or some absurd thing like that. They basically buried the evidence. And of course, it was smart for them to do this because just a couple years later, you had the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania is a ship that was sank that helped drag us into World War I. Now, the Lusitania, the Germans, they put out a notice saying, hey, you know, we're not going to allow any boats into Britain. They did like a blockade around Britain, and they said, we're not going to let any boats into Britain. And they actually specifically gave a notice on the Lusitania. They said, oh, we know this boat is smuggling weapons into Britain, and it will be sank if we see it. And they warned Americans not to ride that ship. Now, what happened? The Lusitania went from the United States to Britain. It was sank. Everybody on board died. And then the West said, oh no, the Germans did this. There was only civilians. There were no weapons on board. And they even made up a lie. They said that the Germans gave the kids off from school the next day so that they can celebrate the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, people believed this story for decades. They believed the Germans were these monsters, that they sank this ship for no reason. There were no weapons on board. Until, in the 1980s, some scuba divers were going to explore the wreck. And then finally, the British government said, hey, don't explore that wreck. That thing's loaded with explosives. But anyway, the point is that these events, which was written in 1984, of the government attacking itself to, continue war, to start war, was nothing new in George Orwell's lifetime. It's something that happened not only in Germany, but also in the West. Britain, you can say by default, since they continued the lie about the Lusitania, also helped in on this. I mean, I'm sure that if you comb through history, you'll find that there's a ton of these false flag incidents. But I digress. Another thing that happened in 1984 that Orwell would have most definitely have been aware of is children ratting out their parents. Children ratting out their parents was pretty freaking common in a lot of countries. Of course, in Nazi Germany, you had the child youth program, but in communist Russia, it was also particularly popular. There's actually a story told about a kid. The story goes, the kid ratted out his father, and then the family killed the child in retaliation. And this messed up story was supposed to encourage kids to rat out their parents. Like, do it for this guy. Don't let his death be in vain. Don't let them deter you. That's them trying to deter you. Double down on it. So they actually told this propaganda in communist Russia. I'm sure Orwell would have been familiar with this story. But not only in communist Russia, not only in Nazi Germany, but then if you look at the United States, by that time in the United States had put Japanese people in internment camps. And you have actually a lot of stories. I tried looking over the internet. I couldn't find them on the internet, but you have to trust me. I took a history class specifically about Japanese internment, and it was a really annoying history class. It was actually a capstone class, and I had to do a whole fucking, I think it was like a 40-page research paper into the Japanese internment. And I can promise you, in the Japanese internment camps, there were Japanese Americans who turned in their parents. And the reason why they did this is because before this was happening, the Japanese were actually trying really hard to Americanize their kids. They were trying really hard to assimilate and to fit into the American lifestyle, although they were being rejected heavily. I mean, the people on the West Coast were super racist against Japanese. But what this ended up doing is it ended up making the kids, these firstborn American kids, I guess you can say, but their parents were like first generation immigrants. So it made these kids want to be even more American. So what they would do to try to appear to be even more American was turn their parents in, even though their parents had done nothing wrong. Another example, in 1984, you had Big Brother come in on Winston and tell him to exercise. You had Big Brother project himself into the house via a Zoom call. Now there was a primitive form of this before 1984 was even written. FDR had I think they were radio. Yeah, it was over the radio. So he would have these radio talks with the American people, and he would try to do it directly to the American people. And he would say things that are somewhat true, somewhat inspirational, but the purpose of it was pure propaganda. This was propaganda messages beamed directly into the home that people listened to on the radio. Now, look at this. You look at it, but the fact is that this kind of propaganda, this kind of Big Brother entering the home or being projected in the home, one way or another, was occurring in his lifetime. And not only that, during Orwell's lifetime, you also had the rise of food guides, the government giving you food guides, which of course they're not mandatory. In 1984, they would probably been mandatory. But you also had the rise of compulsory education in Orwell's lifetime. And one factor of compulsory education is PE, physical education. So maybe Orwell wasn't talking about those things, but those things were there. I think that he was a smart enough man to see that, yeah, this is the government telling you what to do with your life. This was the beginning, and not even really the beginning. I mean, it occurred before this too. But the fact is that it occurred in Orwell's lifetime. What he was writing about was not fiction. There's, of course, other instances of this. I mean, doublespeak propaganda was definitely popular. Newspeak, the elimination or the changing of words to influence the way that people think. So Orwell experienced all of these things. Now, what's the problem with people failing to see this? What's the problem with people seeing Orwell as fiction, or at least the Orwellian government as fiction? Of course, the characters are fiction. Of course, Winston was a fictitious character. What's the problem with people only now seeing the Orwellian government, with them thinking the Orwellian government is only currently rolling out now? Well, the problem with that is that they take the problem less serious than it is. If they don't see that the Orwellian government has been around for a long time, then they don't see it as a chronic issue. They see it as a temporary issue, or as an issue that they can manage and prevent from happening. They don't realize that this Orwellian government is decades, if not centuries old, and the grip it has on society is a lot stronger than they think. And the problem with that, of course, is then they fail to act. When they fail to realize how serious the problem is, they think that they can hit the snooze button. You know, most people nowadays, they procrastinate until the last moment, until right before it's due, until right before, if they don't act, it's all over. And that's exactly why you have to make it clear to them that it's already over. The assignment was due already. The other team turned it in. We didn't turn ours in because we were led to believe that we had time. We were led to believe by these people and all their silly talking points that no, this new world order, it's somewhere in the future, that it won't be actualized until there's a one world government, and all of these other warning signs that then people sit by and they wait for, not realizing that no, you're already living in it. This is the brave new Orwellian world that you've read about, that you thought was in some distant future. It's already here.